Hello. In the previous video, we learned what a border is. Now it's time to learn about padding. So let's begin. Say, for example, we have a block with some text. To create this block, in HTML, we created a div with class A, and we added a p tag inside. Then, in CSS, we specified the height at 300 pixels, width 200 pixels, and background color yellow. And now, let's try to add a border to the block. For that, we write border 5 pixels solid black. As you can see, we got a black border. So with all this, you should already be familiar. Look at the text inside the block. It is right next to the block border. And how do we make it so that there is more space between the border and the text? For that, we need to use a property called padding. Let's try to add padding 10 pixels and see what the block does. As you can see, now we have a padding equal to 10 pixels between the border and the text. Also notice that if we trace our original block with an imaginary line, meaning before we added the padding, you will see that we added an extra 10 pixels to each side of the block. And what if we change the 10 pixels to 20 pixels? Then, each side of the original block will be expanded by 20 pixels. So remember, padding creates a margin between the block border and the content of the block. It's also worth noting that if you just write padding 10 pixels, for example, then you'll have a 10 pixels padding on each side of the block. And if you want a different padding for each side, then instead of writing one value, you write 4. For example, if we write padding 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 10 pixels, then starting from the top going clockwise, the padding will be 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, and 10 pixels. If we provide two values, for example, padding 30 pixels, 10 pixels, then the top and bottom paddings will be equal to 30 pixels, and then the left and right paddings will both be 10 pixels. If you write padding 10 pixels, 30 pixels, 20 pixels, then at the top the padding will be 10 pixels, at the bottom it'll be 20 pixels, and then on the left and the right it will be 30 pixels. You can also specify the padding for a specific side only. How do you do that? Just like how we did this with the border in the previous lesson. You need to use additional words in the property name, like top, bottom, left or right. For example, to create a right margin equal to, say, 30 pixels, like the one that you can see on the screen, what do you need to do? You need to write padding right 30 pixels. The same logic applies to any other side of the block: padding bottom, padding left, padding top. As we already mentioned, padding adds size to the total size of the block. So for example, if the width is 200 pixels, the border is 5 pixels, and say we also add a padding of 10 pixels, then to each side of the block you're going to get an additional 10 pixels added. So what's going to be the overall width of the block now? 200 pixels initially, plus 5 pixels of the border on the left and right, plus 10 pixels of padding on each side, brings us up to 230 pixels. So pay attention to this. This is really important. But say we want the width of the block to be fixed at the one we specified and not have it changed. For that, there's a special property called box sizing. This property can have two values: content box and border box. Content box is the default value. It means that our width only applies to the content of the block, and all the borders and padding then add to the total width that we set. But if we use border box, then our width takes into account all our borders and paddings. So this means that our content is going to be pushed further inside our block if we add any paddings and borders. Good. We got the theory down. Now let's get into some practice. Okay, so here we're looking at a block. And in the HTML, this is done by a div with class block. And then inside we have the text hello. So in CSS, we specified the width, height, background color, text color white, and font size 24 pixels. Let's also add a border to our block. Let's write, for example, border 5 pixels solid, and we'll make it black. We save it, and now we have this black frame around our block. As you can see, the text nearly breaks into the border. So let's add some padding to the top and to the left sides, actually to the entire block. So for that, we're going to write padding 10 pixels. There, as you can see, now we have these paddings on each side equal to 10 pixels. And notice how the padding increases the size of the block itself. Meaning, first we set the block width to 300 pixels, but now it's in fact considerable more than 300 pixels. How much more? 300 pixels, plus from the left and right we have another 10 pixels each, so that's 20 pixels. Plus the border also increases the width of the block by 5 pixels on each side. So how much do we have in total? 300 plus 20 plus 10 is 330 pixels. The same goes for the height. We start out with 200, plus the border is 5 plus 5, so 210 pixels now. Plus the paddings on each side is 10 plus 10 adds another 20. So overall we end up with 230 pixels. But if we want our borders and padding to be included in the initial size, so that overall the width stays at 300 pixels, then we're going to add box sizing border box. And now, if we refresh the page, watch this carefully. See, our width shrunk back to the initial 300 pixels, even though we still have the border and padding. Also, we can specify the padding for each side individually. For example, padding left 50 pixels. In this case, the top, right, and bottom paddings will be 10 pixels, but the left one will be 50 pixels. Let's refresh the page. And now we got 50 pixels on the left, and everywhere else it stays at 10 pixels. Notice that even though we added a padding of 50 pixels, the overall width of the block did not change because we have set box sizing border box. That's it for now, and see you in the next one.